We have noted Kamala Harris's polling issues, and they're real. When you take a look at how Trump is doing in those swing states, right? We've got the big three there: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and then we've got the Sun Belt. You've got Nevada, Arizona, and then we swing on over to Georgia and North Carolina, and you have Donald Trump up in all of them. This is a terrible place for the vibes candidate, the joy candidate, Kamala Harris, to be. But then it got stranger, in that Kamala Harris just the other day decided she's taking a day off from campaigning. What in the world do you mean? How is that even possible? Who takes a day off from campaigning 2 weeks before an election? Well, maybe we're only scratching the surface of the real issues of this Harris campaign and candidacy. And when thehill.com writes a piece, an opinion piece that says maybe Biden was a stronger candidate all along, maybe that's what they've discovered. Tony Katz Today. Good to be with you. Ed Morrissey joins me right now from hotair.com, where he is the capo de tutti capo. His latest piece, Houston, she has a problem. You can find it at hotair.com. No one does a better job than you in being able to get into the granular, into the nitty gritty. You wrote a book, Going Red, which you can find at amazon.com, wherever fine books are sold, about this concept, about what counties happens on a county level and how that affects the states and how you really go about winning elections. She took a day off from the campaign, which is insane, but you went a step further in taking a look at some of the things she's doing. And this insanity doesn't end with a day off, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, first off, the day off was supposedly to prepare for an NBC News interview, right? I mean, candidates are supposed to be able to do those types of things just as part of the normal day. You don't drop out of the campaign for 2 weeks before the election to prepare for an NBC News interview. Although if you saw some of the clips coming out of there, you might understand why she did. Apparently, she couldn't remember the name of the state of Michigan when she was talking about Battleground states. She said, well, I've been to Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and what's that other one?
And she needed the reporter there, the anchor, to save her on that. It was a Rick Perry kind of moment, but not with as much charm, is really what happened.
Right, yes. I mean, you're right. And Rick Perry actually at least had an excuse. He was on painkillers because he had back surgery like 6 weeks before that debate. And I don't think I'm trying to recall what it was he forgot. It was the
third department that he was going to eliminate from
it wasn't the state.
Yeah, it wasn't a state.
It wasn't
no.
It wasn't a state he needed to win. So I mean, she's awful at this. But the thing about Friday is really curious. Now, I wrote that, and then later after I wrote it, they announced that Donald Trump was also going to Texas. But he's going to do the Joe Rogan podcast live in studio.
Yeah.
And that's a podcast that reaches 14 million people. It's got national reach. It's going to be a big deal. She's going to Houston to do an abortion event locally in a very blue area. And apparently she's going to be there to support Colin Allred, who at the moment, he's the person running against Ted Cruz for the U.S. Senate in Texas, at the moment is trying to distance himself from the Biden-Harris administration on border security and crime. None of that makes any sense whatsoever to me. You don't show up in Texas 10 days before an election when you're trending losing in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and what was that other state, Tony?
That'd be Michigan.
Michigan, yes, Michigan.
Talking to Ed Morrissey of hotair.com. Now that Senate race is kind of fascinating, right? Ted Cruz, Colin Allred. The Emerson poll has Cruz only up +1. That seems to be an outlier of a poll when everything else is +3, +4. And you and I have both seen Ted Cruz in these tight races before. You live in Texas. You have a better feel for what's going on there. But the argument that you're making is, what presidential candidate fighting for their life in the Rust Belt or in the Sun Belt makes the decision, you know what? I'm going to go to an abortion rally in Harris County, which is Houston, to support a guy who doesn't want me. None of it makes any political, from even the most baseline political observer, which you are not, it doesn't make any political sense at all.
It makes no political sense. I mean, the explanation that I've heard is, well, she wants to emphasize abortion because that will resonate in these in these other states. Well, she could do that in Michigan. She could do that in Pennsylvania. She could do that in Wisconsin. She's doing it in Texas, which most of the people in those other states aren't even really going to know about. And it's not going to change the direction of Texas in any particular way. It probably, if it even impacts the Senate race, it'll probably impact it in the wrong direction for Colin Allred, just because, again, she is not popular here in Texas. And the polls, if you look at all the polls, and there's not a ton of them in the presidential race because nobody thinks that the presidential race is going to be close here. Trump is ahead by about the same amount he was ahead 4 years ago. And Cruz in the same polls is running just about a point behind Trump on that. Trump's about 50.5. I think Cruz, the aggregation is 49.5. The problem with Cruz is that Cruz isn't really on the air as much as he needs to be. And he did this 6 years ago too. He's kind of not very aggressive in campaigning in Texas. I think he is just relying on the fact that Texas is red and he doesn't have to spend a bunch of money here, but he's not as popular. He's not as popular as John Cornyn is in Texas, and I think he needs to be a little bit more energetic about his campaigns here. Eventually,
by the way, that's a statement.
Candidate that can compete against him.
That's a heck of a statement. Cruz is not as popular as Cornyn is a damning statement in a lot of circles.
It really is, yes. But he is popular. He's just, I think what it is that Cornyn is more charismatic, and Cruz really tends to rub people the wrong way. Even people who support him, he tends to rub them the wrong way.
Right.
And it's just a basic fact. It's always been an issue with Ted Cruz. It was one of the things that hampered his presidential run too. And we could get into why that is, but it's sort of off topic at the moment. The point is that he probably is a little bit more at risk than people might think, but I don't think it's a serious risk. Right now, the polling shows him pretty much running as a slightly weak incumbent against a non-entity challenger, and I don't think we're going to get a Texas is turning blue moment here. But certainly, if they were going to try to turn Texas blue, they wouldn't send Harris to do it.
Talking to Ed Morrissey of hotair.com. Let's bring it back to this presidential. So Kamala Harris is campaigning in Texas, discussing abortion, trying to reach those people in the blue wall states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, who may be voting on that very issue. But she's not in Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin. Instead, she's sending surrogates like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama.
What's interesting about this, too, is that it happened 8 years ago. I don't know how many people remember this, but it was one of the eye-popping things for me 8 years ago. In the final weekend of the 2016 election, Barack Obama made an emergency trip to Michigan. And I wrote about it at the time, and I thought, why are they going? And I asked, why are they going to Michigan? Why aren't they looking at states where, Democrats don't have as much reason to, to be confident, right? It's a blue wall state. And I thought it was just odd that they sent him to Michigan because he was Hillary Clinton's top surrogate in that cycle. Well, it turned out there was really good reason. Their internal polling was showing that she was losing Michigan, and she did lose Michigan. They were sending Obama there to improve the odds because Hillary Clinton was not well liked. This year, this week, they're sending both Obama and Hillary Clinton to Michigan, even though she rubs people the wrong way as well. She couldn't close the sale in Michigan 8 years ago. They're getting Harris out of the way, and they're sending top surrogates into Michigan to try to reverse the polling trend there. And then Harris is really falling behind there. And I think more significantly even than the polls show, because let's not forget, too, that the polls in 2016, the public polls in 2016 showed Clinton up by about 5 or 6 points in Michigan just before the election. She ended up losing narrowly. I think it was 0.3% or something like that. It was a very narrow loss, but the polls were off by about 5 points in that. I'll pull the data up here in just a second. But, at this point, 8 years ago, on October 23rd, 2016, and this will be about a week before they sent Obama out there to shore things up, the national polls, the aggregation of the national polls had Clinton up 11 points in Michigan. And right now, Trump's up 1.2. Yeah. So I'm gonna extrapolate that out just a little bit and assume that the gap is more like 4 or 5 points in Michigan, which is the reason why they're sending Obama and Hillary out there, and they're keeping Harris out.
The idea that you're going to send Hillary Clinton to work and help on the charm offensive speaks volumes to what people really think about Kamala Harris, talking to Ed Morrissey of hotair.com. And that opinion piece in The Hill was the opinion piece you knew was going to come. It was just a question of where and by whom. Maybe Biden was the stronger candidate after all. I think that that's a little bit disingenuous because they knew Kamala Harris was weak. They just believed that Biden was incapable. But they knew that this was the Kamala Harris that they had. They believed that the vibes and joy campaign from the media could get them through November. It seems, and I want to know your take, that they had no plan for this moment. And the plan was hope that this moment, when people see Kamala Harris for what she is, the lack of policy, the lack of personality, the lack of gravitas, the incapabilities, the incapacity, the lack of capacity to be able to rationally engage a thought, to share an idea. They thought this moment would never come because their strategy now seems to be, oh, well, people saw us. It's like, well, I just lost the game of hide and seek. There's no strategy here, Ed.
No, I think that the piece in The Hill was talking about something that is clearly missing from the Harris-Walz campaign, which is a connection to the working class and middle class, like a cultural connection, a real cultural connection, some idea that you actually understand the working and middle classes. Harris will say, well, I was born in a middle class household, or I was raised in a middle class household. And you can say that all day long, but she doesn't know how to connect, whereas Donald Trump really does. And Joe Biden did too. I mean, we can talk about how that was more of a conceit than anything else, and we can do that all day long. Joe Biden was a patrician, from one end to the other, but he knew the lingo, right? He could go and talk about being Scranton Joe, and he could talk about corn pop, and he could make those emotional connections. And again, I will say this every time this topic comes up. You go back and listen to his 2012 speech at the Democrat National Convention, and it's brilliant. He ties the working class identity, that whole union-based to some extent, but broader than that. He ties that whole sensibility to progressivism, and it was really the speech of that convention. Now, Biden in 2012 could do that. Biden in 2024 is incapable of even completing a sentence, if you read Bob Woodward's new book. But Harris doesn't have any of that. She doesn't have any credibility. She's never spent any real time trying to develop those ties, trying to figure out what those voters are like. She is simply pretending, and you can't do that for very long without it becoming obvious. And that's what the problem is. It's not that she has a Catholic problem. It's not that she has a union problem. It's that she has a cultural disconnect from the vast majority of voters. She is the only really culturally connected academia progressive elite. And that's her language, that's her mannerisms, that's her agenda, and she just simply can't broaden it past that.
Ed Morrissey, hotair.com is where you find him. Ed Morrissey on the Twitter X. That's 2 R's and that's 2 S's, by the way. That's where you follow him. Always a pleasure. Much more to get to. I'm Tony Katz. This is Tony Katz Today.